Happy St. Patrick's Day. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Beth Brady from Mote Marine Laboratory. Dr. Brady started her career as a nurse, but soon discovered that her love of marine biology was very, very great, and she went back to school to Kutztown, for her undergrad, and then after graduation, she volunteered at multiple marine mammal and wildlife organizations, found her love of manatees. She did an internship with the Florida Fish and Wildlife, and after the internship, she completed her master's at Nova Southeastern University, became involved in underwater sound manatees, and she completed her PhD at Florida Atlantic University. She's been at Mote for just a year now, right?
A year today.
So with that, Dr. Beth Brady.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to reiterate a little of my backstory that Joe gave you, because most of the people, one of the most common questions I get asked is, why do you choose manatee? So, like Joe said, I started out as a registered nurse, and you can tell by my scrub tops, I had a lot of scrub tops with marine mammals on them. So I always had this passion to be a marine biologist. But I was scared of all those classes like the physics and chemistries, and I went through nursing school, and I thought, if I can get through nursing school, which was really hard, I can get through anything. So I went back and went to grad school, right? So I first, like Joe said, I went to Kutztown University for my bachelor's, and they were kind enough to put me on their alumni page. So I went there for my undergrad. And then when I finished, I was like, well, I'm in Pennsylvania. There's not a whole lot I can do up in Pennsylvania. I might as well move to Florida. So like I said, I volunteered at a lot of organizations, and I got to do some wildlife rehab, right? So this was a dolphin that I was able to work with. So I actually led this dolphin around its enclosure, and you might know this dolphin. I worked with Winter before she lost her tail. Right? So that was me leading her when she first came in. So I volunteered a lot of organizations. I was like, well, that's not quite enough for me. I had this very inquisitive nature. So I did my internship at Florida Fish and Wildlife. I worked in their photo ID program. And this is where I was first introduced to manatees. I fell in love with manatees. And I knew that they made sounds, but I didn't know there wasn't a lot of literature on manatee vocalization. So that's when I went to Nova Southeastern University. And that's where I first looked into what is the manatee vocal repertoire. So these are 3 of my sites, one which you might know there. Some of you, Joe, goes with me quite often to Port of Swano Park. But these are some of the sites that I went to and did my first work. And then after that, I decided to go on to my PhD. But during that, I also, when I was working my PhD, I also got to learn and work with other animals. So these are North Atlantic right whales. This is a study I did with Dr. Ed Gerstein, so that's how close they got to my boat. And this is a calf, right? We did some of the sounds, studying the sounds of right whales. And the calf, like when they start to get a little bit older, they tend to breach when they're getting away from home. This is when they produce some sounds. So let's play some sounds of North Atlantic right whales for you. North Atlantic right whale. That's pretty cool, huh? I also got the opportunity to do some dolphin work, right? So let me play just a little bit of dolphin. So we would go, there was health assessments with dolphins, and they would capture dolphins and do like a checkup on them. And we would record the vocalizations while they were being captured to look for their signature whistles or something for dolphin, how they identify them. So let me show you some sounds out of some. I love this image. So alligators. I attempted to do alligators. So I had a colleague of mine who's interesting. When alligators are ready to mate, they bellow. And what happens is they make this rain dance on their back. So they use infrasonic signals to make the rain or water move on their back. So where do you record alligators in the wild? It's kind of hard sometimes. So we went to St. Augustine Alligator Farm, where there's about 100 alligators, right? So you put a hydrophone, and I had to enclose it in this casing here that you see so I can protect the hydrophone. And Yeah, but the alligators treated it like a chew toy. They were very fascinated, because any animal in an environment that's in captivity is very inquisitive, so they treated it like a chew toy, and they shredded my hydrophone. And after a couple more tries, where everything we put into, they shredded, I have given up on recording alligators, but I did attempt to try alligators, but that's always a good story to have about alligators. But acoustics is fascinating. So you can put a hydrophone or an underwater microphone in the water and learn so much about the environment around you. So a lot of things make noise, right? So sound travels a lot further in water than it does in air. It travels about 1,500 meters per second underwater, about 340 millimeters per second in the air, right? And we have what's called passive acoustics and active acoustics. And passive acoustics is a lot of what I do. I just put a hydrophone in the water and I just listen to the sounds around me. Active acoustics is putting sound into the water and seeing what happens. So I usually do that when I do playback experiments, or I play sounds to animals and I want to see how they're going to react and how they're going to respond to the sounds that I played to them. So this is some of the equipment that I use, right? So this is a hydrophone, it's just an underwater microphone. Think of talking into a microphone on land. It's the same kind of thing underwater. We just call it a hydrophone, right? Because it's in water. That on the far left is what I haven't used yet, but that's called a D-tag. But that's what some scientists use to attach to individual animals. You can get individual animal vocalizations. So what do I look at, though? So this is a spectrogram, right, or a visual representation of sound. And I use special software to look at sounds that animals create. Now, this is an image of some animal sounds, and this is great, right? This is really nice, clean, and clear. This is exactly what you want to look at when you're looking at vocalizations. However, the ocean is not, like, not without noise. So this is what I normally see a lot more time, right? A sound buried in some noise. So there's a lot of what we call noise in the environment. So what I'm going to do for you now is I'm going to play some sounds for you, and I'm going to see if you can identify what these sounds are. Is it anthropogenic, meaning it was caused by man? Is it biological, meaning it was caused by some kind of other animal in the environment? Or is it just ambient noise, so maybe streams or things of that sort? So let me play this sound for you and see if you can identify it for me. Anyone have an idea? Rain? Ooh, that's not rain. So this is the spectrogram, this is the sound, this is actually what I physically see. Shrimp. Excellent, yes. Snapping shrimp. This is the bane of my existence. Anytime I go out in an environment where there's salt water, I get a lot of these guys. The fascinating thing about snapping shrimp is you see that large claw there? That large claw creates this cavitation bubble, which pops and makes that snapping shrimp sound, right? So what does that cause and what does that do? Potentially, we think it could be stung prey. Maybe it's a mating thing. We're not quite sure. I don't think that's potentially what it could be used for. Here's the next one. So it's right down here, the sound that it's creating. It's rather low in frequency. Any ideas about what that might be?
Seal or otter?
Walrus.
Fish. Toadfish. Fish create sounds. They're usually rather low in frequency, usually less than about 6 kilohertz, but fish make sounds, right? So that's more of a biological. What about this one? Sounds a little loud, sorry. Any ideas? Just running water. There's a lot of currents, right, in the water that could be creating this sound, right? So this is more what we call ambient noise. Last but not least, I'm sure you'll know what this means. Kind of. This is an anthropogenic noise or man-made. Any guesses what that might be?
A boat? Screw.
Yeah, motorboat, right? What manatees see a lot of and hear a lot of in the wild. So for my research, you had to think about what would manatees talk about? right? So let's think about manatees, right? So we know a lot about dolphins, right? Dolphins tend to live in groups. Do manatees live in groups? Sort of. You might see manatees in groups in large aggregations, but what we know about those groups is they're very short term, maybe hours to a couple of days. What about predators? Animals that have predators tend to make a lot of what we call alarm calls, or calls that alert them to a predator's presence. For example, meerkats. Meerkats, they make 13 different calls. It's crazy, right? Each one for a different type of predator. What about manatees? Do we know them to have predators? Man, yes, exactly. But predators, natural predators, right? So there's only some evidence from sharks and alligators. I love that picture because that's an alligator in there amongst a group of manatees, and the manatees actually harass the alligator. That's in Blue Springs. So no, not really an issue for manatees. So they're not going to make a lot of calls, right? What about their food source? It's stationary, right? They don't have to chase it. They don't have to hunt it. It's stationary. So dolphins will make echolocation clicks to help them find their food, and they cooperatively forage together. So do manatees need to make a lot of sounds? No, we wouldn't think that they would, right? So, and we also look at their brain. So why would communication be important to them? So if you look at, I hope I get the right, the auditory portion of their brain, huge, right? Manatees have phenomenal hearing, even better than us. 500 hertz up to 96,000 hertz. Great hearing capability. Look at their visual cortex. Very small. So manatees have somewhat good spatial acuity, right? I mean, they can't really see fine detail like you and I can, but they can see outlines of things. So maybe vision is not that important to them. Most of the time they live in rather turbid environments, so vision is not important to them. What about this? Their somatic sensory. Those hairs. Manatees have hairs on their back as well as on their face, which they help to detect potential food sources. But again, just remember that auditory section is huge, so communication would be pretty important to them. So where did manatee vocalizations come from? So this was a paper that was done in 2019, 2018. We just found this out a couple of years ago. So this study was done by my colleague, Nell Marie, who put a hydrophone on the throat region, like right is where our vocal folds are, and on the nose, right? Now why the nose? So sometimes when manatees make vocalizations, you can see their noses are moving. But what she found was the sound was coming from the throat region. They did some anatomical dissections to find out, yes, they do have vocal folds. But just like us, when we vocalize, our sound comes from here, but it resonates up in our heads in those air spaces, right? So something similar is happening in manatees. Folk sound comes from here, comes up, and resonates in our head to come out as the sound source. So what do we know about manatee vocalization? So if you look at the literature on dolphin vocalizations, it's vast, it's huge. We know so much, but we know relatively little about manatee vocalization. So what do we know? So the fundamental frequency, or the lowest band that I've outlined for you in this series, or like the pitch of the call, is between 2 to 5 kilohertz. It's like the frequency of my voice that I'm talking to you now. The dominant frequency band, or the one that has the most energy, is the one frequency band right above the first fundamental frequency. Most calls have what we call harmonics. There's harmonic frequency bands. And many calls have what we call frequency modulation. I'll get into that in a minute. So we also know that manatees stay with their calves, moms stay with their calves for about 1.5 to 2 years. So wouldn't it be rather important for those two to communicate with one another? Most definitely, right? And we also know there's multiple species of manatees, right? So there's manatees, the West Indian manatees, which consists of our Florida manatee and Antillean manatee, right? We have the Amazonian manatee, which is in the Amazon. You have the African manatee, right? And then you have the dugong, which I love personally, because it's a great name. But that's over in the Indo-Pacific. So there's multiple species of manatees. Do they all make the same calls? No, right? So this led me to my research. What is the manatee vocal repertoire? Are these calls associated with behavior? So great, what is the vocal repertoire? How do they use them when they're interacting with other animals? Do calls change with age, right? So as your kids grow, you notice their voice changes, right? In time it goes from more higher pitched to more lower pitched. Do manatees do the same thing? And last but not least, are calls different between species? So for example, you know, like someone in China has a different language than we do. And even more so, you know that there's differences between someone who lives in New York or someone who lives in the South who have a drawl, right? So are they different just in different geographic locations? So the first one is, what is the manatee vocal repertoire? What calls do manatees make? And this is what I showed you as part of my master's work. There's the 3 locations that I use. There's Crystal River, which is a warm water aggregation site. So manatees don't tolerate temperatures less than 68 degrees very well. So they're aggregating in these warm water refuge. And Crystal River, which is on this coast, is one of them. Blue Springs is that place where I showed you with the alligator. It's another warm water aggregation site. And my favorite site right down the road here is Portosweno Park, which is a summertime aggregation site where manatees go for freshwater. Right, so I put hydrophones in there. I left them in place for 24 hours, right? So I'm getting a lot of manatee vocalizations. So what I did was I did a lot of statistical work, and then I categorized 5 call categories based on what I saw when I tested this statistic. So there's 5 call types: a squeak, which is really talked about a lot amongst the existing literature that we do have, a hill-shaped high squeak, a squeal, which is a noisy sound as you can see, a squeak, squeal, and a chirp. And I'm going to play some of those sounds of manatees for you. You can be surprised at what manatees sound like. A lot more high-pitched than what you're expecting, right, for such a large animal. So, now we know that, but that's great. I've defined their vocal repertoire, but what does that mean to a manatee? Just because I think it's important doesn't mean the manatee thinks it's important, right? So the next step we ask is, are these calls associated with behavior? Do these specific calls mean anything? Right, and so for that, I went back to my sites, right? I went to Portosweno Park. I went to Harbor Branch, which is on the east coast of Florida. It's another passive thermal refuge where manatees go when the waters get a little bit colder. I went back to Crystal River again. Every year at Crystal River for about 18 years, they do what we call health assessments. They would capture individual animals and they would do a health checkup on them, right? So I got to record these manatees while they were being stressed. Right? And Singer Island, again, it's on the east coast of Florida. It's a natural area where there's seagrass beds, so I wanted to get manatees in a bunch of different sites. So I looked at a couple of different things. Number one, how many manatees were there? Right? You have to count the number of manatees and make sure they're all engaged in very similar behaviors. And then I wanted to know, do calves make a different type of call? So how do you know if there's a calf or not? So here on the left, you can see what's called cow-calf position. The calf tends to stay right behind to the mother's flipper, and then I look for observations of nursing, because sometimes those calves, when they get bigger, it's hard to tell them apart from a smaller calf, right? So I used cow-calf position, and then I looked at nursing. And then I looked at a couple of different behaviors, right? What do manatees do a lot of? Number one, they like to rest a lot, right? So they do a lot of sleeping. So I looked at animals that were resting at the surface and animals that were bottom resting, right? So when manatees are bottom resting, what they do is they'll go down in one spot, they'll wait about every 6 to 8 minutes, they'll come up, breathe, and go right back down to the same spot where they came up, right? Feeding. Manatees spend at least 8 to 12 hours a day feeding. So how do you know when manatees feeding if it's not at the surface? So manatees will sometimes go down, they'll forage things off the bottom, they'll come up with a mud, they'll create a mud plume, they'll have mud on their nose, and sometimes after they eat in one area, they'll go to another location, they'll do it again. And they'll come up and breathe a little more frequent intervals. Stress, like I said, you're surrounding manatees in a net, and that's actually me, the buoy, right here, recording animals as they're being captured. They tend to vocalize a lot when they are being captured. And last but not least, let me play this for you again real quick. This is cavorting, or what we call playing. A lot of physical interaction where manatees are playing and rolling, and you probably see a lot of this at Portosweno Park. So, we also want to know, like I said, so manatees create relatively few call types. So, you guys have dogs or cats? I bet you can tell by the way your cat meows or the way your dog barks what it wants. Does it want food? Does it want to go out? Does it want attention? But it's still a bark, and it's still a meow, right? So what happens is your dog or cat changes the structure of the call just a little bit to let you know what it wants. So manatees, we think, don't make a lot of call types, right? So to see if they're changing the structure of the call, we actually measure parts of the call that might indicate that something different is happening, or there's a different behavior taking place. So I looked at what we call high arousal or low arousal behaviors, right? So I would think a high arousal would be stress and cavort. And what I would expect in those behaviors to have a more modulated sound. So this would be more tonal, maybe low arousal, maybe resting with feet. I would expect, whoops, back up. I would expect to have more tonal, right? More highly aroused, I would expect to have more modulated. We call that frequency modulation. Another thing I looked at was duration. Think of an animal might be in more heightened state. Big as the kids when you're playing around, they're like, ah, their vocalization might be a little bit longer. Last but not least, I looked at entropy, or amount of noise in the call. And that's like this. So imagine your TV set going off back in the day, that white fuzz, that's noise in a call. And sometimes these noisy calls are associated with aggression in other animals, right? So look for those factors when I was looking at vocalizations that manatees create. So what did I find? So first and foremost, this call right here was produced by calves, we found. It's highly correlated with the number of calves that were present. The more calves that were there, more of that call type. This one was created no matter if they were resting, playing, stressed, or feeding, right? Ubiquitous throughout, which made me believe, like, okay, did the structure of the call change? These, we'll talk about, were also quite dominant. So there are 3 call types. Out of the 5 that I described, I really only saw 3, meaning manatees use relatively few call types. It makes sense, right? They don't need to use a lot of calls. What happened with the different behaviors? Were any calls associated with any different behaviors? Well, like I said, these are manatees they like to rest. They get really comfy, and sometimes they get really comfortable, right? But what did I find here? Again, they made these stress calls, but they were tonal, more flat. Feeding. Here's a great video of some manatee feeding of some algae off of the wall. That's how close I got to get before they put the fences up at Port Soya. Play what normal feeding sounds would sound like. So manatee sounds like when they're chewing that hard substance. So what do you think I found there? Do you think I found more tonal calls, or did I find more modulated calls? What do you guys think? Exactly. I found more tonal calls, right? Low state of arousal. They're about playing. Or cavorting. Yeah. Very, very interesting when they're playing. Because it mimics mating behavior, right? What do you think I found there? Do you think I found more modulated calls or more tonal calls?
Modulated.
Exactly. I found more modulated calls. And I found more of those noisy calls. So, like I said previously, this usually can be associated with aggression in other animals. But are manatees aggressive? Maybe, right? So when they're playing like that, it mimics mating behavior. So imagine you're a male manatee, you're trying to mate with that one female. So potentially, they could be aggressive. Another potential thought is that they're in a heightened state of arousal, right? They're just excited, they're playing. So I saw this call type even when animals were feeding and resting. So just maybe there's some other animal coming towards you, you're just getting excited because there's just another animal there. Oops. And then stressed. What do you think I found there? Do you think they were more modulated? Oh yeah. They were more modulated than the animals that were playing. And they were so much longer in duration, right? But they primarily made that call type. So the noisy call type, right, not used in aggressive. Not used in stress. Because some animals make really noisy sounds when they're stressed. Not manatees. They make calls that look like this, very modulated, and a lot longer in duration. But now I'm going to talk to you about the other species, right? Like I said, you might know the difference with someone who lives in Ireland and someone who lives in England. There's differences in the way people talk, but what about for manatees? So on the top, I have a Florida manatee, and on the bottom, I have an Antillean manatee. Can you see any differences between the two? What do you see? No. So they have very, very slight differences. They're more slightly downward facing south. But we know that their vocal anatomy is extremely similar. So do you think their vocalizations would be different? Not really. So we're just doing this study. We're finishing up the analysis right now. We're looking at vocalizations between Belize, Panama, and Florida. And what we're finding is they're relatively similar across species. They vary just slightly, but why? So like I said, maybe there's that geographic separation. Just because you live in New York, maybe you have a different talk than someone who lives in the South. Maybe there's habitat differences, right? Or maybe it's who's making the call. So a younger animal is going to be higher in frequency than an older animal. So we don't know exactly why there's differences. There could be multiple reasons why there are slight differences. What about Amazonian manatees? Can you see the difference in Amazonian manatee on the left, Florida manatee on the right? Do you see any differences between these two species? Amazonian manatees are the smallest of the manatee species. They live in fresh water, right? And they have those nice white bellies, so they're quite small. So this is an Amazonian manatee vocalization. The interesting thing about Amazonian manatees is they vocalize in notes, right? So here would be one, what we'd see for a West Indian manatee, but here we have this little extra part here, this little extra part here. They vocalize in notes, slightly different from the West Indian manatees. Then we have African manatees. Who knew African manatees make vocalizations? This is an African manatee on the left, Florida manatee on the right. Do you see any differences? What do you see? Yes. The snout, right, it's a little bit different, and the eyes are a little bit different, but still really similar, right? So so what we did was they put a hydrophone out in Cameroon in Lake Assa, right here. And that's where they put out a hydrophone for a couple of days. This is what Amazonian manatee vocalizations look like. And interesting enough, we just published this last year, the first characterization of African manatee vocalizations in 2021. But what they found was really interesting. These vocalizations were produced mostly at night. Why do you think their vocalizations were produced more at night? Potential reasons.
Communicating with each other.
Moving around. They're still a food source in Africa. So potentially they produce more because they're using this area at night, so they're not being hunted during the day. So this is what we're recently working on now. We're looking at vocalizations across all three species of calves. Do they change the calves amongst species? And what we're finding is there's a lot of overlap between the Florida and Antillean, right? So there are subspecies of one another, right? The Amazonian manatees are up here. Smallest, they're going to make vocalizations that are higher in frequency. You have an animal that's smaller in body size, say a mouse, it's going to make a more higher pitched vocalization than say something like an elephant, right? Makes sense. But do their calls change with age? So this is very interesting. Remember that hill-shaped call I talked to you about earlier? We thought these are associated with calves, but we don't know, are they younger calves or are they older calves? So here we took some vocalizations that we measured from individuals, and we had the lengths of these individuals. So here there's their lengths across the top. This animal is 128 centimeters, 132. What do you notice here? Is this hill-shaped in smaller animals, and as it gets older, it starts to flatten out and becomes more linear, that adult-like squeak. Same thing with Antillean manatees, right? Here are the lengths across the top, more hill-shaped, and becomes flat as they get older. Why do we care about this? So in Florida, manatees are a lot easier to study. They aggregate in warm water refuges, right? Do they do that in these warm countries like Mexico, Puerto Rico? No. They're so much more difficult to study, right? And like I said, they're still hunted. So they're not going to come near a boat. If they see a human, they're going to run. So we can put a hydrophone in the water, and we can look and we can tell the approximate size of the calf, whether or not we have a calf, right? And where they would potentially be. And in fact, that is the crux of my research, and I'm very happy to take any of your questions. Why are they hunted? Food. Food source. They're eaten still in Africa. Believe it or not. Unfortunately, you're still eating. And actually, African manatees are omnivores. meaning they eat fish. And sometimes they'll steal the fish from fishermen's nets. So they may be competition for humans trying to get their food source, right? So they can see them as a threat, unfortunately.
What's their population?
You really don't know. So Africa is a huge country, and some of my colleagues are working there still trying to figure out the population size. Even the population that we have here, we don't really know the exact numbers. So I always like to talk about the surveys and see the numbers of manatees that we have, right? That's always the minimum estimate. So when they do synoptic surveys, they do it at a certain time of year. It has to be cold for a couple of days. They'll fly over those aggregation sites and they'll count the number of animals. That's usually the minimum estimate, because you can't get animals that are down at the bottom. You can't get animals in areas that they aren't surveying. So that's always the minimum estimate of the number of animals that we have in the population. We don't know what they are right now because they haven't done the surveys for the past 2 years. One was because of COVID, and the last year because it was too warm. So we really don't know. They should be coming out with their numbers and hopefully soon for what we're at. They're just a rough estimate.
You'll just tell us something that kill when they die.
Yeah, so there are scars on manatees from boats. Unfortunately, it was how they look at the population over time, how they can identify individuals and determine habitat use. So the sad thing about that is manatees usually, from studies that they've done, get hit a minimum of 10 times in their lifetime. Could be up to a maximum of 50 when animals hit 50 times in their lifetime by a boat. But the average per animal is 10. It's incredible, right? That's way too many. Way too many. Yes?
Do manatees respond to recorded vocal calls as you control?
Oh, yes.
They do.
Oh, yes. So I've gone to Mexico twice and played sounds to captive manatees. And every time I played sounds to them, they turn around and orient towards the speaker and go towards the speaker. They also increase their vocalization rate. They make more vocalizations. Right? And then we're trying to find out, so does that differ between if you play male sounds, female sounds, or if you play the two different call types? And that's what we're working on now. We're actually going to be doing that with Hugh and Buffett and not to do some future. So we did it in Mexico with a group of females. We're going to do it with Hugh and Buffett, which are a group of males, and see if their responses differ based on sex. Yes?
In humans, the hormones change a lot according to the age. And it's not the only, but it's an important impact on the human voice.
Yes.
It happens the same with men, the difference of hormone levels.
That is a factor that could be also be why they're changing the structure of their vocalization. So we're going to be doing some anatomical studies. So I'm getting some heads from manatees that have passed away to look at the anatomical structures in the throat to see how they change with age. But it also can be an effect of hormones as well. You're exactly on point. So there's a slew of factors, multiple factors that can contribute to the change in the structure of the vocalization. And hormone development is definitely one of them. You're welcome. Any other questions? Yes?
Do they ever make a sound when they're swimming out of the water?
Yes.
Or does it always have to be translated?
Most of the sounds are like if you were swimming in the water with them, you could definitely hear the vocalizations that they're making. So I always hear the when they're out of the water. And personally, I don't think that's a vocalization. I think that's just them clearing their throat, because one time I was out there and they eat a lot of plant material. Sometimes things come out. So I got hit by what I call a plant rocket. Right? So I usually think they're clearing their throat from the plant material. Because usually when they're chewing, they can't make any type of sound. So I think that's what I think they're doing. I don't think it's a sound that they're using to interact or communicate with. Yes?
You said that they can stay down 6 to 8 minutes. Is that maximum amount of time?
Usually it's the maximum is 20. I've never seen 20, ever. And I've spent about 100 hours in the field. Yes?
I'm sorry, I hope I'm not the only one in the room, but some of the questions I can't hear.
Oh, you'd like to repeat them, of course. How long can manatees stay underwater? Okay, right? So the maximum they always say is 20 minutes, although personally I've never seen it. I've seen as long as 8 to 12 when they're resting. When they're playing, it's a lot more frequently. And it also depends on the size of your calf, right? The size of calf is going to come up a lot more frequently because they're just smaller and a smaller lung capacity. Yes?
I want to ask you something about behavior. So
Sure.
I live in Palmasol, so I see them all the time, and they're wonderful. But are they friendly? I mean, they like a beer can. when we go to beer can with the kids. If
Mhm.
the kids are in the water, there's a couple that live right in that little basin right there, and they always come out. And they always go between their legs, and, I mean, are they really wanting to interact, or, I mean, we don't touch them, but are they?
It depends on your animal. So are they friendly? Do they want to interact? So there was a study done not too long ago determining that manatees have personalities, right? So yeah, your answer is yes. Some animals will interact with you. Some animals want absolutely nothing to do with you. I would go, there's this one animal, her name was Volumnia, right? I think Joe, you photographed her. And I would go up and just talk to her outside. She'd be like, see ya, I'm off. But the interesting thing, and I didn't tell you about Joe's and studies working with me on a small study, when they go to this aggregation site like Porta Swinger Park, we want to know what do they do in there? Because we really don't know if they have a defined social structure, meaning do they hang out with other animals and how long do they hang out with them? So I chose to focus on animals who had scar patterns that we had identities of, like we knew whether or not they were male or female. And luckily we got a lot of females. And so far what I've learned is, I like to say females always have a headache. When you go in there, they want to be left alone. If anyone else approaches them, they're like, no, see ya, I want to walk over here, please don't interact with me. And my theory behind this is usually when they're out in the wild, males want to try and mate with them. Like you'll have one female being what we call an escort, being escorted by 15 males, just waiting until she's ready to mate. So there's always someone following a female. So I get it. It's like they just want to be left alone. They're coming to a spot, they want to rest, they want to drink. We know.
The other one was when we're washing our watercraft, they're always coming up, or do they want fresh water? Why is that behavior? Because it's so predictable. As soon as we wash it, their sounds are up.
So manatees probably can determine where fresh water is, and they have phenomenal memories. So they're related to elephants. Elephants, well, they never forget, right? Manatees have absolutely amazing memories. And they metabolically need fresh water. So they have to reach into a fresh water source every couple of days. So the interesting thing I was learning about this UME is some people say, why can't you take manatees out of this area and put them somewhere else? And they try, right? But they're so ingrained, and they're so what we call site fidelity, meaning they know this specific spot that they learned from mom in the 1.5 to 2 years that she was with her. So go right back to it. Even though there's no food there, they're still going back because that's what they know. That's what they know.
And will you see Antillian manatees in Florida water?
I don't think we've documented any of them yet, but we definitely do see Florida manatees going into and those other waters. So there's manatees been documented in the Bahamas, in Florida, Cuba, and Mexico, and one that documented all the way up into the Chesapeake Bay. They go over as far as Texas, right? So yeah, and they're traversing and going a lot further than we ever were. So one when Crystal River went to Cuba, right? So they're going a lot further distances than we were originally thought.
And then if you're at the beach and you see a school of them go by and they're going fast, are they on a mission? Or?
So usually when you see manatees together, they prefer to be in groups, but they don't stay in those groups. So I was watching a lot of manatees throughout my PhD work, and I watched them enter and exit an area. And they usually come in by themselves and leave by themselves. But they would come and associate with a group of animals, and they're like, all right, I'm ready to go. They don't usually stay in this group. They're very temporary in association. Any other questions?
Lifespan?
So you might have heard Snooty. Snooty is the hallmark. He's about 69 years old, but unfortunately in the wild, their lifespan is usually a lot shorter. Anywhere up to 40 years, I think, is what some of the stuff that Safety Manatee Club has documented over the years, because they have a lot of other stressors in the wild. Yes?
Do sharks like to eat manatees, or are they concerned about the high fat content?
We have found some animals with shark bites on them. So they are a potential food source. The dugongs, which I didn't get to talk a lot about, they're over in the Indo-Pacific. They are a predator of sharks. Not so much here in the States, but they have found some ones with shark bites on them. Yeah, and there's a high fat content. I think it's more just mouthing them to figure out, like, oh, that's not really what I'm kind of like the others do. Yes, sir.
What about the food that they're eating? How we have a problem, don't
We have a significant problem over there. So part of what I've done this past winter was I learned how to fly a drone. And we were flying drones over at the CCEC site where they were feeding the manatees. And what we did was we flew the drones to, number one, look for critically ill animals, animals that are side swimming, and look for the body condition of the rest of the animals in there. You're amazed at what you can see when you're up there. You can see emaciated animals, right? So that's one of the things we're doing up there. But yeah, their food source is in a bad state. And what we know thus far, and what we're starting to see, is there's macroalgae, meaning something else is coming in that's not necessarily taking the place of seagrass, right? But is that good for the environment? You know, we really don't know quite yet. Manatees are shifting their diets. There's a recent study that just came out literally a week or so ago that manatees are eating more macroalgae. But what does that mean? So, you know, we can eat a lot of chips. Is that good for us? We don't know the answers to that yet, right? Is it like a junk food for manatees, or is it something that's healthy? It's something that remains to be seen. Now, what does that mean for the rest of biota? If you go to seagrass bed, you've got seahorses, you have juvenile fish, all kinds of stuff live in seagrass beds. What lives in macroalgae? I really honestly don't know. So we're going to go out and put some hydrophones out there and listen. Because like I said, all that ambient noise, the snapping shrimp, the fish, you can listen to all that and go, wow, I have a really healthy environment if you can hear all those sounds. But what if you don't? Oh, who knows? And that's what we're going to find out soon, hopefully. Yes?
How does the manatee defend themselves against the predator?
They're large size. They're extremely large. They don't really have predators. Once they get to a certain size, like I showed you the picture of that alligator, they get to a certain size, they're not really seen as a food source anymore because they're too big. I guess it's too much energy for a crocodile or an alligator to look at and go, I'm not even going to attempt that. And when you take a manatee on land, they have a pretty powerful fluke. People have broken bones if they get on the wrong end of the tail of a manatee. And there's actually a video out there, if you look on from Florida Fish and Wildlife, where people were trying to rescue a manatee, and they bring it on board and they get flipped off because they're so large and strong. All right.
Now with the food, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
The food supply, is that just to our manatees, or what about the
So that's-
Asian and the others?
Mostly concentrated on the East Coast in the Indian River Lagoon, where they've had a lot of what we call harmful algal blooms. Like, and it shades out. So it sits on top, it shades out the seagrass and kills the seagrass. And that's, a lot of those harmful algal blooms have happened over the past 2010 to 2017. And I didn't even know this before I started looking into it, but it takes at least 3 years for seagrass to come back, and up to 10 years to get those full, lush meadows that we're used to seeing. And that's if the conditions are right. If you're planting seagrass and the conditions aren't right, you're really just throwing money, you're probably lose the seagrass again. So we need to fix the underlying issue before we can have some healthy seagrass again.
Have you been able to identify certain vocalizations as to their meanings?
So, it's right now it's hard to localize in the wild. So that's another plan that we have, is to put multiple hydrophones to localize to individuals. So if one animal makes the sound, how does the other one respond? It's really difficult. Now imagine you have 5 animals and they're playing. How can you identify which individual is making the sound? Really hard to do that. But on some occasions, like I said, I had some calves in the wild that would separate from mom, right? And they would make that hill-shaped call when they were separated. They also make that call when they're stressed. They also make the call when they're playing. So it's almost to me like a stereotypical call, meaning the thing that doesn't, a call type that doesn't change no matter when you produce it, right? So it could be that the calf makes a hill-shaped call under varying behavioral states, and it just doesn't change, but it just changes with age, right? It doesn't change with the behavior. So we're still looking at it. It's really hard to do. That's why I put some of those D tags on. So we also know that animals have individuality in their vocalization. So just like my voice is different from your voice, manatees have individuality in their vocalizations. But do they use it to identify one another? Well, moms will identify their calves, right, based on that individuality. But the specific features of the vocalization, we don't know what those are that they're using to hone in on to figure out whose vocalization, like what they're using to identify. Like I can hear by the pitch of your voice, and you know when someone calls you on the phone, you don't physically see them, but you know who it is, right?
Did they ever find out why that manatee went up into the Chesapeake? It was so
Who
strange.
knows why they go there? I mean, it's just could be looking for a food source, could be to find a mate. You never know why they go that far. He did it again. He did it like twice, I think. They actually rescued him again recently, so they know he's still alive. It's usually males. Sometimes they're roaming to find a mate too.
And when they're cavorting, because on a canal and they cavort all the time, that's not their reproduction.
So it's mimicking mating. So
Yeah.
Usually when they're mating, they're not very vocal. And my theory on that is, I don't want any more competitors in there. Why am I going to make a sound? I don't want to make a sound. I don't want to draw anyone else in, because if they hear other vocalizations, manatees will come, right? So they're very quiet. And when we're playing, they're very vocal. Yeah, they're very vocal. There's someone else in here who I missed. Yes?
More about how they interact with humans in the water. Do they ever show aggression?
So there's very few studies done on this that actually show this. In captivity, yeah, they describe it as aggression, but every researcher has a different definition of aggression. Some say pushing and shoving is aggression. There was one study done where an Antillean manatee butted a researcher, and there is sometimes aggression that they notice in food, around food, in captive environments. So is it aggression, right? So I always think potentially it could be aggression when they are playing or when they're mating. Sometimes they're even aggressive towards females. Females have been known, male manatees have been known to drown females when they're trying to mate with them. So I consider that to be aggressive. So there's some, and they all want to mate with that female. So I would consider that being aggressive with one another, right? So they can mate with that female. But they are, sometimes they kill female manatees.
But they don't fight. They don't fight humans.
They have molars.
They have more.
Right, so they don't have teeth. No, dugongs.
But they don't try to gum you.
Dugongs have what we call tusks.
Yeah.
Now, they're not like elephant tusks. They're just small and so big. You'll see some scratches or like rake marks that you might see in dolphins. You will see them on other dugongs. And that's actually how a colleague of mine in Egypt identifies individual dugongs, is by some of those rake marks and nicks and notches that they might get from the tusks. Yes?
If a manatee is being transported, what's the maximum amount of time that you got in the water?
I'm not sure about that one, but I know they do tolerate it rather well, because they've taken animals from Florida up into Ohio for rehab facilities as of late. So, you have to just think about, it's a very large animal, so all that weight kind of compresses onto their lungs and makes it a little bit more difficult to breathe. So they can be out of water for a significant, I don't know the exact amount of how long, but they can tolerate it fairly well. Yes?
Who is looking at your research specifically, and does it help the manatee survive as a species? How is it being applied?
So one of the reasons we can use acoustics is to look at, like I said, in a lot of other locations, we really have minimal ideas of where manatees go, and they're not as easily accessible. So in Africa, like I said, they're hunted. It's a huge area, and it's very expensive to do a lot of aerial surveys, right? Like $200 an hour, and then you got to fly the whole coast of Africa. So you have to use multiple methodologies, right, to try and find your animal. So acoustics is just one method. So you can put a hydrophone in the water, and you can determine whether or not, first of all, are they there or are they not, right? And if they are there, who's there, right? And then if you want to do more research, you can focus in on those areas. Plus you want to know how it's being affected. So anthropogenic noise. They found that noise of boats can affect the vocalizations of animals, right? And also can potentially cause temporary hearing loss. So something I'm interested in looking at, so imagine Crystal River, right? All those tour boats, you have manatees there in that really enclosed area. Imagine you being at a rock concert for 8 hours. You come out, your ears are ringing, right? That's called a temporary threshold shift. It's a minor hearing damage. What about manatees? All that boat noise, I'm not saying this happens every day, but it potentially could happen if you have a lot of tour boats up there, or personal watercraft. Think around the holidays. Around the holidays, I actually put a hydrophone in. It was December 31st when I did my master's degree, and all I had all day long was boat noise. Imagine if you happen to stay warm, you have to stay in this one spot, boat after boat after boat after boat. You could potentially have some hearing loss or a temporary threshold shift.
That would explain why they get hit.
They have really great hearing, but it depends on where the boat is coming from, right? If you're in the water, especially underwater, it's really hard to hear where boats are coming from. If it's coming from behind them, they have a lot more difficult time localizing it than if it's in front of them. So yeah, if they're here and the boat's here, a lot more difficult time. Yes?
What is the gestation period?
12 to 14 months. 12 months. Mm-hmm. Yep, and they usually have one calf. Twins do happen, but it's rather rare, about 4% of the population. Yes?
Would an unrelated manatee take care of another?
It has happened. right? They adopt another cat. It has happened up in Crystal River. They have it documented. It's not frequent, but it does happen on occasion. Yes?
Do you ever study any of the manatees that are at the Apollo electric station?
I have when I worked with Florida Fish and Wildlife. It was a prime place to go for photo ID. So how they identify individual manatees over long periods of time is by taking images of their scar patterns and how they determine where their warm water refuges are and do they visit the same warm water refuges. So they'll go there and they'll take images of manatees, and that's what I assisted with there. But otherwise, it's a very large population, and some of the questions that I ask, you want smaller groups of animals so you can identify individuals and what's happening. But yeah, they do some work there.
How many animals would you get?
At that site, I don't know. So at CCEC, we counted 1,000 through the Cape Canaveral Energy Center. So I would assume there'd be something around 500 or so there. I'm not 100% sure of the exact numbers there. But there's a lot of individuals too during winter months.
Are they being fed?
No, not on this coast. At this coast, we have sufficient, at least for now, seagrass. On that coast, no, we do not. Unfortunately. Yes.
Are they territorial?
Ooh, no, they are not known to be territorial, but dugongs are. Dugongs will patrol in area, and they actually have two different mating behaviors. So I know they have herd, like mating, like we saw mating behavior where you have one female with multiple males. So they do what's called lekking in dugongs, meaning they'll patrol a certain area, they'll kind of put on a little show and patrol and vocalize and hope to attract a female. It's something they notice in Australia. Pretty cool, right? Some other species do that too.
Do you think you'll ever be able to identify them solely by their vocalization?
There's people working on that. I tend to think not, because like I showed you, they change the structure of their call depending on the behavior they're engaged in. So there's individual parameters in there, but when you have so many individuals, it's really hard to tell them about. In small groups, in groups of 10, yeah, you can pick them out. But if you have a group of 50 to 100, it's a lot more difficult to do that. So you would have to have one individual manatee and like a very small group to be able to do individuals and track individuals. Now dolphins are different because they make what you call signature whistles, and they're unique to each individual. So manatees do have identity. They are something that you can identify, but I think it'd be a lot harder with the more animals that you have. Yes?
How much do they weigh?
Average is about 1,300, but they can get up to 2,000 pounds, which is large. And the females are usually larger than the males. They're pretty large. They're the ones who carry the babies, so they get to be a little bit bigger. Anything else? Yes?
In Crystal River, is it regulated in any way to keep it from overcrowding them when they need that space to keep warm, and do they have to go out to eat? There's not enough food in there?
So there is the springs in the back. And when the temperatures get cold for about 3 days in a row, they close that off. And that area in itself, they close off to boats. But in the front, and they ironically call it Idiot's Delight, it's a passageway where anyone can go through. So that's always open. And there's always boats in through there. And that was always my concern, like, how many boats are in there? And when I did it back in 2010, how many boats there are now? Right? And everyone knows you can go there and swim with the manatees. How many boats are going through there? How many kayakers are going through there? And you can pet them there. You can actually touch them. Now the rules are you can't touch them unless they approach you, but does everyone follow them? Right? So what does that mean for the animal? You don't know. Some animals might like it. Some animals might not. But the interesting thing was there was a study done on dolphins tourism activity over a long period of time by a colleague of mine. She found that these tourism actually shortened lifespans of dolphins because number one, the stress of the noise and constantly being harassed or with tour boats on a daily basis. Yes.
Oh, you said that they need fresh water, and so often here in our area, how do they get fresh water?
For the swim park. It's a man-made boat basin, but it's outflow for, I believe it's in the Braden River. It's flowing into there, Joe, is that correct? It's fresh water. So they go in there, and that freshwater layer is less dense, so it'll stay on the surface, goes all the way out to the end, and then goes into the bay. But they'll come in there for that. They'll find it in hoses. They'll find it just about anywhere. They seem to know where it is, and they remember where it is. But here's the thing, and that's why we don't want people putting hoses off their docks, right? Like, oh, I'm feeding the manatees. It's great. What if you leave? Then what do? Because they remember that, and now you're not there anymore. That's why we don't want them to become dependent upon humans for something. Because after you leave, you're not there anymore. Right? Now where do they go? Now they got to find something. It might take them a long time to find it. We don't want them to do it. We want them to rely on natural sources.
But like you said, they remember when we come in with our boat.
Exactly.
I just learned that today.
They are so smart.
Yeah.
You know, we don't really give them enough credit. When I showed you the image of the brain, maybe you notice it's smooth. It's smooth. We have what we call it, like the gyres in the brain, or folds or ridges, usually associated with intelligence. Right? The manatees' brains are smooth. And they think they're dumb, but like I said, they have phenomenal memories. They trained Hugh and Buffett at Mote to do tasks, to do performances, do hearing studies, and what studies with the sight. Like, how do you train an animal? And they still remembered it. Even after a couple of years later, they asked them for some kind of command, right, where they wanted him to do something that was similar to what they had done in those experiments, and he remembered it. It's amazing, right? So it's fascinating. Yes?
Yeah, the memory is one of the things that was an advantage for the old trainers when they got Hugh and Buffett, because they remember their targets very well.
Oh, yeah.
But there's behavior that Buffett does that I can't find an answer to. He likes to come up to the window and smash his snoot right into the glass, which just sets off screams of delight with all the children that are there. I don't know if he can hear them, but I'm wondering, what is that doing for him with all these fiber-saved cells working? What is happening there for him?
I got in a lot of trouble for this when I was there the one day and explained my reasoning. So animals are in captive environments. What do they have to do all day? They get bored sometimes. And they have what they call stereotypical behaviors. Behaviors that they do that might be some kind of benefit for them that helps them get down that cycle. Some like tigers will pace, right? Personally, I think it's a behavior that he does because he's bored. Other people would tell me, like, no, you can't say that because he does it because he gets enjoyment out of watching the kids. I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say either one way or another, but to me, when you have an animal in a captive environment, they do some behaviors to entertain.
So there is some stimulation he's getting.
Oh, absolutely. There's some stimulation. He presses those whiskers. They are very super sensitive. Those whiskers on the face, super sensitive. Super sensitive. Yeah. They can probably use those whiskers on their face to detect changes in current, changes in temperature, all kinds of different things in there.
Or the presence of other animals around.
Presence of other animals. And that's one of the things we think they use the whiskers for. Particularly the ones on the back and even on the face are more concentrated. Yes?
You say gestation is about 12 to 14 months.
Around there, yes.
How often do they produce calves?
About every 3 to 5 years, right? So sometimes you will see a calf who has another calf.
Did you say 3 to 5 years? So it's really difficult to keep the population.
It's the problem we're facing right now. Yeah. I have a sneaking suspicion they're going to be put back on the endangered species list. We're not. Oh yeah, it's going to happen. I think that's already in the works, but like anything, it takes a long time to have something like that. When you just uplisted it to something, and you're like, this is great, and now we're going to have to downlist it. It's going to have to happen, unfortunately.
Okay.
Any more questions?
That was awesome.
Thank you.